Susanna, and welcome to everyone. I'm so pleased to be here. As I said, I'm Eve Crevoshay. I'm the executive director of Take This. We're a mental health nonprofit organization that does advocacy, research, and training for people who make and play games, including content creators and everyone in the game ecosystem. A lot of what we do is focused on trying to address the underlying issues that create mental health challenges, mental distress, and mental illness in games and in the game ecosystem. So we address things like online harassment and challenges related to extremist recruiting and grooming in games. We talk about studio culture and challenges related to toxic work environments, gender-based harm, etc. And we also address game content and mechanics and the ways that they interact with mental health in both positive and negative ways. Today, on the subject of thinking about some of the underlying issues related to mental well-being in games, I want to talk about accountability and repair as a new way of thinking about how to address harm in games. We know that there's a lot of harm that happens in the game industry and among people who make games. And when I talk about harm in particular right now, I'm thinking about crunch culture, toxic work environments, and of course gender-based harm, which is the big one that's been in the news so much over the last 3 to 4 years. Before I jump in, I do want to acknowledge, as Susanna did, that we are on the land of the Lenape people, and that the work that I'm going to talk to you about, which some of you may know as restorative or transformative or reparative justice concepts, is not my wisdom. I'm a white Jewish woman. This is not where I come from, but I've had the generous teachers and generous folks, in particular two non-binary people of color, who've brought their wisdom to me and been patient and generous in providing that. And so I want to specifically call out Jay Lynn, who runs the Games and Online Harassment Hotline for Feminist Frequency, and Cassie Walker, a licensed mental health counselor who's on the Take This team as a workshop consultant. With that, I want to talk about my journey in this. I've been at Take This for about a little over 4 years. And when I came to the industry, I've come from the nonprofit sector through my career, I was invited by a lot of women into these whisper networks. They're like, well, you need to protect yourself. You want to make sure you're okay, so you need to be in these networks that tell you what's going on, who's bad, who's dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, okay, great. I kind of knew to expect this. And I got into these networks, and it was kind of awful. Because here I was feeling like I was going to get some information that I couldn't really do anything about, except in very limited and quiet ways. And I wasn't going to be able to make change about it. I was just going to be able to maybe protect myself and people around me. And these networks, which are online right now, right, they fuel outrage. They just ramp people up because we don't have outlets. We don't have tools for thinking about safety, for thinking about healing or change or growth. We don't have any of those tools. So here we are stuck. And I was like, this is not sustainable. So I started talking about where could we go that would be better, that would feel like we were making progress forward. And that's where I started this conversation. And then why do I care, coming from a mental health perspective, right? Well, we know that there are lots of protective and structural factors that impact mental health and mental well-being. And a lot of those have to do with the work environment and the way that people are treated, heard, whether or not they feel safe, et cetera. And we also know that harm itself has really negative mental health impacts. And so we need to address that. If we want mental well-being, if we want people to be healthy, to feel like they are capable, to feel like they have a place in the world, we need to think about this stuff really seriously. And so that's where I came to it. And then we know, I was thinking a lot about, well, what's the connection between the work experience and the player experience? And we know there's a lot of good evidence and a lot of good research out there of the connection between the diversity of teams and the quality of decision making and the quality of output, right? We know this stuff. And we can also begin to see anecdotally the connection between the diversity of teams and the real innovation in games. We're seeing that now already. And so we also, as I start to really dive into the implications around online harassment, toxic behavior, extremist behavior, et cetera, and this is research that Take This is doing right now, I'm seeing even more the importance of thinking from the beginning, in terms of design and mechanics and content in games, the importance of diversity. But how do you ensure diversity? You have to create a welcoming work environment. And when you're talking about harm, that is not a welcoming work environment, especially if you don't have good mechanisms for dealing with it, right? So that's why I care, and that's why this is important. And we're all here trying to make games for change, right? We can't do that if we don't take care of our own house first. So, fundamentally, the questions we're asking are, what voices are welcomed and how? Who is in the room? And who is making those decisions? Not just who's in the room to show, hi, there's diversity, there's visible diversity. No. It's actually who is making decisions, whose voices are materially being heard and acknowledged. And you can't do that, you can't have that happen unless people feel safe and acknowledged and supported. Before I dive into a little bit the specifics about accountability and repair, I want to make sure we're on the same page. So, we're going to talk a little bit of vocabulary. Survivor. A survivor is someone who has experienced harm. This is not someone who has had harm done to them, it is someone who has experienced it. So we talk a lot about impact versus intent when we're talking about harm or statements, microaggressions. You've probably heard this in some context. Survivors are people for whom the impact has been harm. And often, hi, I'm a white woman, nice white lady, right, middle-aged. I've caused plenty of harm. Do I want to? Do I mean to? Or do I intend to? No, but I do cause harm. I have to take ownership of that, and then I have to deal with that. And so it's really important when we think about survivors to acknowledge that they're not necessarily being harmed by someone intentionally. Bystanders. People can be bystanders if they've witnessed a firsthand harm, if they have heard about harm, if they have been a support to a person who has experienced harm, to a survivor, or if they have been an ally or support to someone who has caused harm. So bystanders, so what I'm saying is there are so many people involved in the experience of witnessing harm. It's not an isolated experience, but we treat it in HR and in organizations in an isolated way, and that's not a productive approach. And then we talk about, in accountability and repair, we talk about people who have caused harm, not people who are bad, right? And this is really important because fundamentally, we also need to believe that people can change. Until they prove us otherwise, and sometimes they do, and that's sad and undisappointing. But people who've caused harm are not bad people. They are people who have done something. They've done an act. And then finally, because especially right now we're talking about gender-based harm in games, this is a big one, right? We need to talk about consent. Consent is not a part of our vocabulary, our understanding in this culture. We don't learn really what consent means. And so consent is informed. We have to really understand what we are consenting to. We have to understand what we're consenting to and understand if it changes and be able to withdraw consent if the situation changes. We are in a room, everyone's masked, someone takes off their mask. That is a change. We want to leave, right? Consent needs to be explicit. The, yeah, okay, is different from, yes, sure, that sounds good. Enthusiastic. We think about this in terms of consent related to sexual situations, but really it's consent in any kind of situation, especially consent in any situation that involves power dynamics, and work involves power dynamics. And people who have power have the responsibility to provide a space for consent, for that to be addressed when we're talking about consent. With that in mind, I also want to talk about why do people look for support when they experience harm? Why do they report harm? People report harm because they need an acknowledgement that what they experienced was valid. They need validation. Validation is an extraordinarily powerful thing. It's really powerful, and it's really important. And when you have acknowledgement, when you have that validation, there's a lot of healing that happens. And people also, they have a sense of justice. They're like, I want somebody to be taken to task for this. I don't want them to go unpunished or unacknowledged that they're doing harmful things or have done a harmful thing. And I don't want this to happen again to me or anyone else. That's a really important one, right? We want there to be change when we report harm. Our current system, especially inside companies, inside these contexts, is one of punishment, of something done to you. We do an investigation, we determine if there's harm, and either you get fired or you get reprimanded or you get disciplined in some way. Great. Okay, what did that do? It didn't help anyone feel better. It didn't change your behavior or give you tools to learn. And it didn't address the bystanders. It didn't address the fact that this is a community experience, right? And so accountability instead is acknowledgement, and it is active repair and healing, and it is the commitment to and expectation of change. And so you'll hear the word, I'm sure some of you have heard the word carceral, like punishment, secrecy, it's very carceral, it's very based in this like, we're gonna do something to you. Accountability is taking personal responsibility, I have done harm, I will help to fix it. And if you create a culture of accountability, and there is a community behind you that supports that process. Specifically, and I'm gonna use other people's words because they're better than mine. Accountability is the ownership of our choices and behaviors and the impact they have on the world, right? Not the intent, but the impact. It is saying, yes, I did that, and I recognize and I acknowledge that it caused harm. It is that self-propelled obligation. It's the willingness to say, I take responsibility for that, and I take responsibility for fixing it or addressing it in some way. Now, I acknowledge that in some situations, right, accountability and repair may not be able to be direct, right? A survivor may not feel comfortable, a survivor may not feel safe, and so they don't want contact with someone who's caused them harm. That's fine. Maybe repair can be done in some other way to people in a similar situation, or in a way that represents a type of broader structural change, right? Maybe it's a donation, maybe it's work on behalf of some group. But there's some measure of taking responsibility and recognizing that what we've done is harmful. And the second quote from Joanne Smith, I actually saw this on Instagram last week or the week before. She's from Girls for Gender Equity, and she was talking about justice, but really she was talking about repair, right? Repair is all who experience harm receive the healing resources they want and need. And I'll take a moment, just a side note here on this topic of healing and repair. It's often the case that people who have been harmed, survivors, they're not sure what they need right away, right? The process of going, understanding trauma and feeling like you can process it and understanding what you need, that takes time, right? So the thing about accountability and repair is that it is a little messy. It is a little complicated. And it does take a little bit more effort. But it turns out we're humans, we take effort, and it's worth it. So, and on that note, the practice of accountability is ongoing, it is active, and it is specific. So accountability is not a statement. The statement is the beginning of a practice of accountability, a commitment to doing something. Accountability is a process that is undertaken on an ongoing, daily basis around specific commitments and actions for change and growth and repair. And I want to include this wonderful quote from Jaylyn, who I mentioned from the Games and Online Harassment Hotline. We are each of us more than the worst thing we have done. We have all made mistakes. Oh gosh, this one's a hard one for me. I remember that other people can make mistakes. I don't remember that I can, right? But yeah, We are, each of us, in fact, more than the worst thing we have ever done. And so we all have the capacity for change. We all are given permission to try to change. And we should. And we should believe that others can until they prove otherwise. And sometimes people will prove otherwise, right? Sometimes we will see people who are unwilling to, unable to change, and just really keep harming, or really don't seem to engage in a process of accountability. At which point, you know, sorry, but you're not part of this space anymore. That's the way it goes. So I want to finish with a call to action. Because as I said at the beginning, early on, that what we do inside our companies, inside our spaces, how we organize the structures around how we make games, has a huge impact on the experience that players have. And if we aren't welcoming, and if we aren't accountable inside our game spaces, inside our making spaces, inside our studios, we cannot be accountable and supportive of our players. We cannot really do true change if we don't do it well inside our companies, inside our studios, inside our institutions. So how can you, as someone coming here to Games for Change Festival, reframe your own paradigm inside work environments, inside other associations and environments, for harm and consent? How can you do that in a way that is constructive, that works towards change, that works towards transformation, and that honors the needs for healing and repair that individuals who have survived harm require? How can we move beyond secrecy into a place where we welcome the voices that need to be heard? So, thank you. I will be here through the end of the day tomorrow. I look forward to talking to you. I'll be at the speakers event this afternoon, starting at 5. I look forward to more conversation. Then I'm doing a topic table tonight at 6 on why we need to take toxicity in games seriously. Hopefully all of you understand the basic premise of that. But I'll be talking a little bit more about the research that Take This is doing right now, specifically around extremist behavior in games. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm really excited and honored to be working with Games for Change and the Raising Good Gamers initiative, and I appreciate you all being here today. Thank you.